This presentation is to explain the scientific basis of mindfulness and particularly the neuroscientific basis. Mindfulness is traditionally defined in the following way. It is the paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So let me repeat. A mindful person would be paying attention on purpose in the present moment in a non-judgmental manner. And this is a working definition that originated from the famous mindfulness teacher, Jon Kabat-Zinn, about whom I will describe later. Mindfulness means being in the present, simply being here and now, which means that our minds which like to go into the past and ruminate about what happened, making us sad or angry, or the mind starts to fantasize and imagine things about the future. So instead of either one of those, training the mind to be in the present, here and now, and that is being mindful. The genesis of mindfulness can be traced back to the 5th century, to northern India, and to the Buddha. Mindfulness derives its roots from about 2,600 years ago in northeast India, where the Buddha, in his teachings, described mindfulness as part of the Noble Eightfold Path. Samma Sati, or right mindfulness, is one component of the cardinal teaching of the Buddha, the Noble Eightfold Path. During that period, mindfulness was essentially a spiritual practice based on these Buddhist principles. And during the ministry of the Buddha of 45 years, in different parts of India, mindfulness was practiced by his students and followers of the Dhamma. But the journey of mindfulness since then, particularly during the last 3 to 4 decades across the world, has been extremely interesting and colorful. Like I mentioned from the beginning, when it started at the foothills of the Himalayas in northern India, it then moved to the monasteries in Tibet, Japan, Korea, and in Sri Lanka. Mindfulness has been practiced by monks and lay disciples of the Buddha's teaching in these countries. Subsequently, more recently, it moved into classrooms and university campuses and educational institutions, particularly in the Western world, but then again, more recently, to other parts of the world as well. Mindfulness began to take a very serious role in patient treatment management in hospital clinics and wards, again, primarily in the Western part of the world. In maximum security prisons in several parts of the world, mindfulness is now being practiced as a very important intervention for inmates of prisons. Mindfulness is now a serious component in the agenda of Fortune 500 companies, in different offices globally, in boardrooms, and many such business enterprises. And finally, mindfulness has entered parliaments, notably the British Parliament, and I will mention that later. The scientific revolution of mindfulness actually started in 1979, and credited to that effect is Professor Jon Kabat-Zinn, who was initially a microbiologist and a molecular biologist, Professor Medicine Emeritus of the University of Massachusetts Medical School. He popularized the benefits of mindfulness when treating patients with stress and anxiety. So mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, is now a very important core treatment method in clinics connected to managing stress and anxiety in different parts of the world. But it was many years later that the mindfulness scientific revolution really blossomed and took with it the roots of neuroscience. And here we have to speak about the famous Professor Richard Davidson, himself a neuroscientist and the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin, who himself is a self-described closet meditator, because it was not a popular topic at that time to be practicing mindfulness meditation. But in one of his early visits to India, he met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who in fact challenged this young neuroscientist at that time to use these new neuroscientific advances and the tools of neuroscience, modern neuroscience, that Professor Richard Davidson uses in his labs, to see the brain changes that occur with mindfulness and positive emotions like love, compassion, empathy, and altruism. And in 2000, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Professor Richard Davidson, in a Mind and Life Institute forum, which you see on the slide top right, with other scientists and also Tibetan lamas, the scientific basis and how to examine the scientific basis of mindfulness was discussed. In the same slide at the bottom, you will see how His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself is looking and examining the images of a functional MRI with Professor Richard Davidson standing behind him. And also you see in the other two slides, a French meditation master, a molecular geneticist called Matthew Ricard, who specializes in compassion meditation and loving kindness meditation. He himself became a subject of the various neuroscientific tests that they started doing in the University of Wisconsin. So all these tests, the different types of imaging using the MRI, were really to see what went on inside the brain when a person practices mindfulness. His Holiness the Dalai Lama took with him a team of Tibetan lamas, yogis who have been meditating in the Himalayas for years, to become the subjects of this path-breaking neuroscientific testing. So what exactly does mindfulness do to our minds? A mad monkey mind is something that we all have, because it's a mind that drifts from the past to the future, like I mentioned earlier, or the mind keeps drifting from one sense station to another. We are either focused on the eye or the ear or the nose or to the tongue, that is taste, touch, mind, or it is ruminating about the past or fantasizing about the future. By nature, we all have mad monkey minds, and they rarely settle down into the present moment. So mindfulness meditation masters advise us on how to keep the attention on one object and to keep the mind in the present moment, which is an extremely difficult thing to do. So teachers advise us to anchor or to tie the mind to a particular object, which can help to keep it, at least for a little bit, in the present moment. So the classical anchors that are used is the breath at the nostril, or the breathing movements, the abdominal movements when breathing, or when walking, the feet moving, the right and left foot movement, or when we are lying down, to be aware of the posture of lying down. So basically, mindfulness meditation teachers talk about 4 postures which can serve as anchors to keep our mind in the present moment. So this is just to illustrate to you in the slide top left. You have this wild bull who is extremely wild in the forest or not being able to stay in one place. But if we are able to tether the bull onto a post or a tree, like you see in this image, the rope that tethers this wild bull, which is like the mind, the rope is mindfulness, and the tree or the post would be the anchor that we spoke about. But the wild bull or the mind will never stay with one go. It will keep on running and trying to break free because it has never been used to staying in one place. But eventually, the power of mindfulness is such That means the rope that tethers him to the post is extremely a strong, powerful item. One day we are able to master the mind and to tame this wild bull like mind. So, consistent practice of mindfulness empowers the mind. It gives us mastery over the mind and allows us to be in charge instead of being dragged to every sense station that the mind wants to drag us to, whenever, wherever. So, mindfulness, when practiced consistently, regularly, with diligence, allows bookkeeping, which means that we are able to keep an account of what we did, what we are doing moment to moment, without judgment, without self criticism or analysis. Indeed, it's called a type of choiceless awareness. So, the benefits of mindfulness, very simply put, can affect the body and the mind. If you take the mind, for example, it's very well established now that it helps to reduce memory loss, particularly with age. In fact, it counteracts memory loss. It can reduce anxiety, tendency for depression, improves the focus of attention and concentration, helps to regulate our emotions. In terms of the body, it can help normalize blood pressure, improve digestion, decreases muscle tension, stress, and pain. This is expanding further on the benefits of mindfulness on the mind. So it can actually be an important tool to fight post-traumatic stress disorders. That's what you see on the left. It can improve academic focus and performance, helps to regulate emotions so we will not react in a knee-jerk manner. Instead, we will learn to respond with caution. It can fight depression, like I mentioned, anxiety, and memory loss. So, included in the physical benefits of mindfulness, a whole range of stuff has come out through research now, like rheumatoid arthritis, heart disease. It fights chronic pain, helps in bowel disease, and so on. So, there are multiple benefits of mindfulness that are being proved by scientists very regularly today in terms of consistent, regular practice. So, two very important terms came into the vocabulary of medical science, particularly neuroscience, a few decades ago. And one is neuroplasticity, and the other one is neurogenesis. So, neuroplasticity is defined as the lifelong capacity of the brain to change and to rewire itself in response to the stimulation of learning and experience. Now, I must say, several decades ago, the fixed idea was that the brain cannot change and that the brain cannot rewire itself, and that it's a static situation that we are born with. But since neuroplasticity was proven through the different research studies that I will expand on in a few moments, the lifelong capacity of the brain to change and rewire itself has now been completely established. Similarly, neurogenesis, which is the ability to create new neurons and new connections, synaptic connections between neurons, that too was thought not possible several decades ago. But now it is a very well-established fact. So if you look at a cross-section of the brain and look at the three main areas on which it changes as a result of mindfulness practice, first we have this tiny walnut-shaped amygdala, which is sitting in the base of the brain. And it's an extremely small but extremely important part of the brain, because it gets aroused when detecting and reacting to emotions, particularly very strong emotions like fear, anxiety, and stress. With mindfulness practice, the amygdala becomes less functional, becomes less activated, and less dense in terms of the cellular structure. So the amygdala actually decreases in function with mindfulness, and that helps us to regulate emotions better, because amygdala, when it is normally functional, it helps us to react, like I said earlier, and not respond cautiously. Then we have the hippocampus. Again, this area is extremely important for memory, short-term memory and long-term memory. And it also helps to regulate the amygdala, so they work together. This part of the brain, the hippocampus, becomes more active with mindfulness practice. So that regulation aspect becomes better, regulation of emotions. Secondly, it helps us to retrieve data from our hard disk, as it were. Helps us to take the memories that we have stored and recollect what we have done or remembered in the past. That happens through mindfulness training. Then we have, like the chief executive officer of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the one that is responsible for sensible decision making, to be able to act with maturity and sensibility, and to make wise decisions. Now, the prefrontal cortex increases in function and in structure and gets very activated with mindfulness practice. So these are the three main areas, but there are many other areas that are known to change with mindfulness practice. So this is again just a slide to illustrate the amygdala. It's known to hijack happiness because it's the seat. It's known to be the seat of our most fearful and anxious emotions. So when the amygdala is overactivated, we become very animal-like. So it's also called the reptilian part of the brain, whereas when the amygdala subsides in function, becomes less active, as with mindfulness practice, we become more sober and we react less in a knee-jerk manner. Again, the hippocampus, which I mentioned, its main role is consolidating learning from short-term memory to long-term memory and in spatial navigation. So it's a very important region for storing and retrieving information. So it's like our memory center. Again, the prefrontal cortex, everything that I mentioned earlier is in this slide. So it gives us the ability for problem solving, thinking, planning, organizing. So the prefrontal cortex is one area that really benefits very much from mindfulness practice. This is a tiny area of the brain that is sandwiched at the bottom of the two cerebral hemispheres. It's a small area called the insular cortex. Incidentally, this is an area that was discovered also only after these neuroscientific studies became prominent. Long years ago, nobody even spoke of this. The insular cortex, known to increase with mindfulness. Not only is it responsible for emotional awareness and self-recognition, it notes a sense of homeostasis. It's known to be involved in music, rhythm, and language processing and interoception, that is, to know when we are hungry, to know when we are getting angry, to know when we are getting thirsty. So the insula improves its function and its size with mindfulness practice. This is a very interesting slide. This was a famous experiment that scientists often quote. It's to do with taxi drivers in London, because apparently taxi drivers in London, in order to get a job as a cab driver, you had to memorize the map, where over 25,000 locations, that is the streets of London, have to be known through memory. So apparently 16 cab drivers had been taken for this study and they were subject to functional MRI. Now these are cab drivers who had committed to memory the map with over 25,000 streets of London. And through the fMRI, they saw the hippocampus, which I mentioned in terms of memory, short-term and long-term memory. So the anterior and the posterior parts of the hippocampus increased in gray matter. So that this is an often quoted study, but it's very important just to show how certain parts of the brain differentiate the different maps and the commitment to memory. And here the hippocampus is the one that was identified in these cab drivers' functional MRI scans. So Since that initial revolution of neuroscience in 2000, various scientists started doing different studies. And this particular slide just shows some MRI scans where brain regions associated with attention, interoception, which I mentioned earlier, and sensory processing were tested in practitioners of mindfulness. Here again, it's another slide showing the functional MRI of 16 subjects. There they tested them for an 8-week MBSR. The regulation of emotion and the control studies as well. So the reduced hippocampal gray matter was seen in patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. If you remember, this is what originally Professor John Kabat-Zinn tested mindfulness on. This shows cerebral blood flow in the brain in different regions in those who practice mindfulness. So the fMRI showed increased uptake of glucose and also those who have been doing yoga and meditation practices. So they've used, in this case, different types of scans. The MRI scan was one. This is the PET scan, or the positron emission tomography. All of these shows how the brain changes, increasing blood flow, increasing regional glucose metabolism, all as a result of mindfulness. This slide pretty much shows the same things which I mentioned at the beginning. That is the different components of the brain that get affected. As there are two views here. This is again shown in this famous magazine, Nature Reviews, which talks of the neuroscience of mindfulness. So there are certain other diseases more recently that were found to benefit as a result of mindfulness-based interventions. One such is Parkinson's disease, where they found that again in the hippocampus and in other multiple areas, increased gray matter density. Because in Parkinson's, the patient loses control. And with mindfulness practice, there was an improvement of control, empowering the patient, and improved self-determination as a result of mindfulness practice. Similarly, age-related disorders, which I mentioned earlier, which are associated with cognitive function decline, like Alzheimer's, senile dementia, how mindfulness-based cognitive interventions offset these normal declines. These are age-related, and they're very common. So introducing mindfulness practice to people who are approaching the aging period of their lives obviously is going to be very helpful. This again talks about the psychological effects. The references are given under each finding of the research study, where psychological symptoms and emotional reactivity, improved regulation of behavior were all found in practitioners of mindfulness. So basically the message is to take your brain to the gym, which is the practice of mindfulness is actually like training the mind as you would train your biceps or your quads in a gym. So it's actually easier to enjoy the pleasures of life as they occur because you are more aware of each incident in life, the pleasure or the pain. In the case of pleasure, you can enjoy it better, helping to become more engaged and involved in activities with a greater capacity to deal with the adverse events because your emotional regulation is better, resilience is better, coping skills are better. And you're less likely to get caught up in the worries about the future or anticipations or regrets over what happened in the past. A mindfulness practitioner generally is less preoccupied with concerns about whether you're really successful or self-esteem. There's not much involved. You try to, actually the practitioner becomes very much centered and more grounded and not having grandiose ideas about yourself. also being able to form deeper connections with others. The systemic and health impacts, this is an additional slide just illustrating what was mentioned earlier, because immunological effects are very well known now with reduced inflammatory responses. So that's why in chronic inflammatory disease, mindfulness is recommended as a part of their treatment. Similarly, the biochemical effects like reducing cortisol in this and better glycemic control, and this impacts diabetics, similarly cardiovascular and gastrointestinal systems. This is a very interesting slide because the importance of telomeres, which are really little protective caps at the end of our chromosomes, which are inside the cells. This came into focus relatively recently, and the scientists who discovered the role of telomeres actually won a Nobel Prize in 2009, I believe. So very simply, telomeres are protective caps. They sit on our chromosomes and give us a very good protective function. But with age and with cell division, as you can see in the slide, from age 25 to age 75, as a natural phenomena, telomeres begin to lose its size and its strength. It becomes less functional. Similarly, shortened telomeres are associated with conditions like cancer and diabetes and heart disease and so on. And these are connected to an enzyme called telomerase. Now, what mindfulness does is, in studies, they have shown how mindfulness prevents the deterioration and the degeneration of telomeres. So it slows the normal degeneration of telomeres because it improves the secretion of the enzyme telomerase. So mindfulness, of course, practiced regularly, helps the telomeres to maintain its length and strength. So that helps the viability of the cell. That's a very interesting discovery, and there are loads of studies that have been published on this. So this is just to show how countries took mindfulness really seriously. One such country was the UK. Several years ago, actually, I think about a decade ago, they started focusing on mindfulness and its role in different spheres in society. One such was in parliamentarians. So what you see here is a report published from a mindfulness all-party, so it was a bipartisan approach, all-party parliamentary group. The publication was in October 2015, and it was a result of a collaborative effort between 3 universities, Oxford, Exeter, and Bangor, where they found that Mindful Nation UK as a program is something that needs to be rolled out. And like I said, all the parties agreed to it. And the main areas in which they felt mindfulness should be rolled out as a mainstream function was in education, in health, in the criminal justice system, and in the workforce or in labor. So mindfulness is pretty well established in those sectors, at least in the UK, but many countries are also coming on board gradually, realizing its scientific basis and importance. So this is just one study that was published in the Journal of Child and Family Studies some years ago. This is on school children, where they found that social behaviors were impacted, aggression in students decreased, there was an improvement in math scores, and there was a reduction in the prevention of reduction and prevention of depression, anxiety, and stress, and the classroom behavior improved. So in Sri Lanka, the movement called Satipasala began in 2016, led by Venerable Udayiriya Gamadamajiva. He's the spiritual leader of Satipasala and also the abbot of Nissaranavanya, which is a forest monastery. So Satipasala started introducing mindfulness into schools to students and teachers. What is shown here is one of the very first studies that were done. There was an evaluation, a feedback evaluation of 232 students and 63 teachers, where they assessed the ability of the students to understand mindfulness, ditto for the teachers, and how they benefited. So you could see on the left-hand side of the slide, how the ability to be composed. These are the students' feedbacks. So 69%, nearly 70% of the students felt composed, and their ability to work in an organized manner, and the improvement in memory. Similarly, when you look at the teachers' feedback, again, the ability to be composed and to be able to work in an organized manner. So there were clear benefits even from this very initial study of Satipathala Foundation. Another aspect that they evaluated in this particular study was student feedback, how they saw changes in friends. And they found they were less irritated, with a greater capacity to study and a better or a more improved memory. Similarly, the positive behavioral changes which the teachers observed in students. So these are all very positive. And now Satipathala Foundation has launched the program further, and they have covered several parts of the country, and they are taking it also into the school curriculum, I believe, in a year or two. So there is a very strong indication that we will see mindfulness within the mainstream school curriculum very soon. On the impact of an undergraduates, this was something, again, a study done in the US, and very simply it showed the same kind of outcomes, where academic performance was improved, managing mood changes, emotional resilience, coping skills, and emotional well-being. So this is one study, several studies in this one slide, where undergraduates were tested for impact after mindfulness training. I need to acknowledge Dr. Bim Sarasenanaike and Dr. Saroj Jayasinghe, whose slides and some information from presentations were taken for this. And thank you very much. And I hope this presentation exposed at least some aspects of the neuroscientific and scientific benefits of mindfulness. Thank you.